All right, and welcome to another episode of Still Processing, the 76ers podcast. I'm here with Sam Giovanni, of course, but we have a special guest with us today, that being Clutch Points own Brett Siegel. Brett, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. Tight time right before the draft. There's a lot going on, and Sixers are going to be pretty busy this offseason, that's for sure.
Yeah, a lot to talk about around the NBA landscape, specifically with Philadelphia, of course. And you've really been, on top of a lot of the generalized NBA coverage, but had a lot to talk about with Philadelphia as well, including a report that you had at the tail end of last month, about a week ago now, about one Bronny James. So that's going to be the subject, primary subject of what we talk about today, rather reviewing the report on Bronny James, going into how that could connect potentially to LeBron and really where the Sixers offseason could go following that rabbit trail. So I guess really first and foremost, as you clearly pointed out, the Sixers have joined the Lakers and the Suns, who have been the top two teams pursuing Bronny James through this pre-draft process. Now, with this, I guess part that's been kind of made clear, at least initially from Bronny's camp, was that there was, I don't want to say limited interest, but the Bronny was working out just for certain teams to begin. So just, I guess I'm looking for your perception on this topic. Philadelphia, according to your report, is interested in Bronny. What do you think the odds are that Bronny, since he is looking to kind of take a little bit of the power back in the situation, might be interested in Philadelphia as a potential landing spot?
So we can kind of sum up the whole Bronny thing as a notion of kind of he said, she said kind of stuff going on here, where Bronny James is being pursued by teams. He was being looked at the combine, and he's a guy that a lot of teams wanted more info on. They wanted to see what he looked like on the open floor because they never really got to see him much when he was at USC. That was a big concern of his freshman season. He didn't play much, and a lot of it had to do with the medical situation of him going into cardiac arrest last summer and then monitoring his minutes and making sure he was okay. But once he was cleared by NBA medical personnel at the combine, he was on the court for those scrimmages and he performed well. He was one of the biggest winners at the combine, which led to a bunch of teams wanting to bring him in for visits. Ultimately, Rich Paul of Clutch Sports, who is LeBron James' best friend, his agent, and the president of Clutch Sports, and now he's going to be managing Bronny's career. He made it clear that he did not want Bronny working out for dozens of teams. They were going to be selected in this process, only work out for teams where A, they felt like that Bronny would fit in, and B, where he actually had a chance to be a first round pick. Ultimately, the Lakers makes a lot of sense. LeBron's there, and all the chatter of him wanting to play with Bronny. That was one of the teams, and Rich Paul's connections with the organization also makes sense there. The Phoenix Suns were another team with the 22nd pick that have worked out Bronny, and they brought him in for an individual workout to evaluate where he's at in his game. Ultimately, I've personally been told that this was more of a smokescreen, more of gamesmanship, where the Suns are kind of looking at a scenario where, hey, we're going to bring in Bronny and we'll see if LeBron wants to potentially try to come here and we can figure things out to have LeBron come to Phoenix. It's not a realistic scenario. I just don't see any realistic way where LeBron would go to Phoenix. And honestly, this offseason, I don't see him leaving the Lakers. All the chatter is that he's just going to sign one of his infamous 1+1 deals where he signs the 1 year plus the player option with another opt out for next season. So that's kind of what we're looking at for Los Angeles. But there was chatter of those two teams were the workouts, and then there was a mysterious third team. Well, talk around the league was that the Philadelphia 76ers were that third team that were looking to potentially bring Bronny in for a workout. I personally do not know if that happened. If it did, it was very under the radar. But they are interested in Bronny, and that's all because of the same thing as the Suns. They feel like that they could potentially get LeBron James and lure him there this summer. Daryl Morey and the 76ers front office want to construct a championship level team around Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey, and that's obviously where the interest for LeBron comes from.
Yeah, and you pointed out in your article the previous interest leveled from Philadelphia into LeBron James, reaching out around the trade deadline, of course, trying to
Mhm.
land him in that attempt. Also, wasn't Philadelphia's first attempt to bring LeBron to Philly either. So there's that kind of long-standing history of, I guess at this point, it's being unable to bring LeBron to Philly. But in this case, you bring up the Phoenix Suns and the potential smoke screen and the ability to, I guess you can call it even like hopefulness out of Phoenix if they believe it's even a legitimate possibility that they could entice LeBron to come, which, given their financial situation, would prove quite tricky. When you look at Philadelphia, they don't have those same financial restrictions. So I first and foremost just want to say I fully agree with you that I find it hard to believe that this situation ends in any way other than LeBron James ending up in Los Angeles as he currently is. But if you look around the league and you look at the teams who, let's just check off some of these boxes, right? So they have the ability to contend, which is something that you would imagine LeBron James would be interested. Not that anyone can definitively say what exactly he's looking for in his next team, but they would have the ability to contend, which is attractive. They have a wide open pocketbook right now, which is again also attractive. They have the ability to land Bronny James, which you would imagine just based on certain reports out there previously that is a factor for LeBron goes. Time will tell if that is true, if that is not true. But with all that being said, it seems that Philadelphia is a clear contender to land LeBron over Phoenix. With that being said, if anything were to say not go correct in LA, and obviously there was the big news today that Adrian Wojnarowski reported on that Dan Hurley, in fact, did not agree to become the head coach of the Lakers, turned down, I believe it was a $70 million deal. In that case, obviously there's no head coach yet there, possibly JJ Redick, LeBron's podcast partner, we'll see. But if there's any reason that LeBron starts to not feel LA anymore, does Philadelphia, in your mind, become that leader in the clubhouse? Or, is it really just a matter of LeBron's just going to pick whatever destination is most attractive to him based on whatever, Cleveland, Miami, and is he willing to potentially go for that less money just for that situation that perhaps is more suitable to him? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I guess if we're speaking hypotheticals, I would say, yes, you're correct that the 76ers would be at the very forefront of that chase for LeBron James if he was to switch teams, but it just doesn't seem like that's going to be a possibility. Early on, when the season ended, there was talk that LeBron and Rich Paul were going to sit down and figure out what he actually wanted to do in his future. Now, flash forward a month and a half later, now it seems like all indications point to him returning to the Lakers, and the Lakers are of the belief that LeBron's going to be there. They've gone into this coaching search with the mindset that he's at the forefront of their roster with Anthony Davis. They're going into the draft with the mindset that LeBron is the guy still. And even though he's late in his career, we've seen what LeBron has been able to achieve. He can still be one of the guys on a championship caliber team. So I think that the Lakers believe that. LeBron, at this moment, it doesn't seem like that he's going to be opting out and leaving. It seems like that he's going to opt out to re-sign a new deal with the Lakers and restructure things there. So is this something that could play out moving forward? Could the 76ers potentially still draft Bronny in the second round in attempts to lure LeBron next year? Yeah, it's still a possibility. But ultimately, the thing with Bronny is that everyone around the league still thinks that he's going to be going to the Lakers in the second round. I believe it's the 55th pick that they own. And it just seems logical, A, that he'll be going to the Lakers, and B, Rich Paul and Clutch Sports want Bronny to either be a first round pick or go to the Lakers. That's essentially what I have been told from other organizations outside of the Lakers around the league. And that's the belief that people have, is that if he's not going to be a first round pick, well, they don't want him to be a second round pick somewhere else. It doesn't matter the situation. They want him to go to the Lakers to play with LeBron and be a part of their developmental system there. So to answer your question, is it a realistic situation of LeBron going to the 76ers this offseason? No, it is not. But if by some drastic measure he doesn't want to return to the Lakers, yes, he could end up with the 76ers. They would obviously be at the very forefront of those discussions.
Yeah, no, I do absolutely agree. It kind of just seems it's very similar to the last time LeBron James was supposed to be heavily considering Philadelphia, but it almost even seems like a weaker potential reality than it did the previous time. And and you talked about Bronny possibly going in the first round. Obviously, you mentioned Phoenix as a potential team that could look to bring him in the hopes of bringing in LeBron. And this is purely speculative, but you never know if LeBron always wants to go back to Cleveland. You never know if that happens again. They held the 20th pick, of course. But when you talk about the second round, and let's kind of, I guess, just separate Bronny from LeBron for a moment, if that's even possible. This draft has gotten a rap throughout the entire process of not being an overly strong draft. Myself personally, I just believe that it's more so not an overly top heavy draft. I think there's some quality role players throughout this draft, but when you get down to say, I think pick 16 is probably a bit unlikely for Philadelphia, for Bronny James, that is. But when you get down to pick 41, get into the second round, Daryl Morey has an interesting history with second round picks. Almost independent. You can't really separate it, but almost independent of whether or not they're still trying to lure LeBron. The way that Bronny has risen as a prospect, do you think that there is potential value there at 41 for a kind of 3-and-D guard, almost a D'Anthony Melton type that Bronny James could potentially be? Is that something that you think could be a possibility where Philadelphia potentially feels there's value outside of LeBron?
I think so. I think that there's certainly teams that will look at Bronny and view him as a legitimate second round prospect, not just because he's LeBron's son, because of the talent and potential that he possesses. But when you look at the 76ers at 41, assuming that that's where they're going to be in the second round, there's still going to be plenty of talent there and plenty of role players that, in my opinion, are more NBA ready and more NBA suited than Bronny is right now. And in the mock draft that we released today on Clutch Points, I currently have them taking Terrence Shannon Jr., who is a really good scorer out of Illinois. Obviously, there's some concerns there with the trial that he's facing and the court appearance that he was scheduled to make, I believe, today on June 10th. So we'll see how that plays out. But he's confident, and his camp are confident that he's going to be cleared of all the felony charges there. And if that's so, and he's not convicted of anything, he's going to be a guy that teams potentially consider at the end of the first round and early second round. And if he's there on the board at 41, it'd be an excellent fit with Philly, given his natural scoring abilities. He can come off the bench, play out on the wing, a similar role to what we saw with Kelly Oubre this past season. So I think that Terrence Shannon Jr. would be obviously a guy that they would consider. And I think that there's plenty of other names, a guy like Harrison Ingram from North Carolina, a really good rebounder on the wing. AJ Johnson's a guy that's starting to rise up draft boards. He went over to the NBL this past season after being a really top heavy recruit and being recruited heavily out of high school. So I think that those are guys that we're going to be looking at in that late 30s, early 40s. I just don't see a scenario where a team looks at Bronny and from a pure skill and potential standpoint, they view him as a top 40, top 45 guy. I think that he's more of end of the second round caliber, and that's kind of where the Lakers are. It just kind of worked out that way.
Yeah, yeah. No,
I
I
have
think that
some numbers to back up. Zach, it's great that you mentioned D'Anthony. So what you said is true. Between Bronny being LeBron's son, like there's never going to be he's just not a normal prospect. Like guys of his production don't get talked about as much as he has. They don't get first overall pick buzz, and obviously the hard issues that he dealt with really threw a wrench in the beginning of his season. Him not having a normal offseason, going up a level, obviously hurt him a lot. But I was curious to see if prospects like him do get drafted, these smaller guards whose value comes from defense and their offensive upside is questionable. So this is a very specific stat search that I ran through StatHead. If it's too specific, let me know. But I looked at freshmen roughly at Bronny's size. He's listed at 6'4" in Basketball Reference, which seems a little much, even with shoes. So I had it from 6'1" to 6'5", and I think he's closer to the 6'1" side. But freshmen of that size, whose per 100 possession averages are 14 points, 8 rebounds, 6 assists, and 2 steals. There's plenty of guys at varying levels of college hoops who didn't go into the NBA, but 3 names did stick out to me as guys who did get drafted in the second round. One is Colby Jones, who was drafted last draft.
Last year by
One
the
is
second round, yep.
right. I think that was actually the Sixers gave up that pick in the Thibault McDaniels trade, interestingly enough. But so he was one guy. D'Anthony Melton was another, and JD Davidson. Yeah, I see him. Was another guy. So that's obviously very weirdly specific stats. But those are 3 guys who were drafted in different parts in the early second round, mid second round, late second round. So for to lend what Brett was saying, that Bronny is more of like a late second round type of pick. Like he definitely does have a legitimate draft stock. Obviously, again, it's affected by being LeBron's son, and that's nothing that he has control over. But he is someone that guys like him do get drafted, and I think especially with how far along the game has come since some of those other guys were drafted, like it does seem likely that the end of the second round makes the most sense for where he's going to get picked. And with the Lakers having the 55th pick, obviously that's like a perfect match right there.
Yeah, I will be interested to see if there's a team that potentially, and again, part of it's the reputation of this draft class, but if someone attempts to buy into the second round, potentially, kind of right ahead of the Lakers there, and there's a lot of gamesmanship to potentially be had in this situation that I think it's going to be just a really interesting storyline to the entire draft as the entire process continues really up until we find out on the exact day of. But speaking of the Sixers draft, of course, we talked about Terrence Shannon Jr. as a possible second target. Out of
Mhm.
curiosity, Brett, who did you guys have going at 16 to Philadelphia in that case?
Well, it's interesting because it really depends on who's going to fall out of the lottery in that spot because you have guys like Isaiah Collier from USC, a guard that could potentially fall there. You have Dalton Connect, who is an older guy, a shooter who could potentially fall out of the top 10. And if he falls out of the top 10, well, how far is he going to go there? A guy like Ron Holland, who could potentially fall out of the top 10 as well. So I think that the 76ers are in a spot where you have to evaluate what kind of talent's going to be on the board there first before making a decision. Obviously, if there's a player out there, a role player that's already established in this league that they have their eyes on and they can get before the draft and they're interested in, yeah, I think Daryl Morey and the Sixers will pull the trigger on that. But when they're on the clock, I think that's really when we're going to see a potential move. They may move down a few picks and then potentially move out of the first round altogether just to see if they can gather future assets and maybe get a role player with a like let's just throw out a scenario where you trade down from 16 to like 19 or 20 in that range, and then you get like a future first round pick out of it or 2 second round picks. Then you can take that pick and maybe you flip it again to get a role player there. So I think that there's possibilities, and I think that the 76ers are going to be looking at this draft pick kind of in a similar approach of when they got D'Anthony Mellon a few years ago, where you kind of gave up a few assets to get Mellon, and I think that could be a similar path to where we follow this season, and the 76ers end up with a solid secondary role player like that. So to answer your question there of, well, who's going to be on the board, who can they target in this volatile draft of everyone could potentially be falling, it just really depends on who's going to be on the board there.
Yeah, and volatile, I think is absolutely the right word. I mean, there's so many players who, and then part of this goes to the sheer fact that there's again not a consensus upper echelon, I should say. There's well, first of all, there's not a consensus number one pick, let alone, I mean, there's a number a one and a two. It seems to be clearly, but outside of that, there are very few, surefire all stars. Who's a role player. Very few defined roles. So, and there's been a lot of really interesting fast risers. One guy, of course, being a name that Philadelphia fans are very fond of, that being Devin Carter of Providence, who seemingly now, I believe I even saw that he had a promise in the lottery, so is now even completely out of range for Philadelphia. But definitely a lot of draft coverage still to come, and a lot of interesting storylines to figure out between now and then. Just thank you so much for covering that with us, Brett. One quick thing that I did want to go over, before uh, just before letting you go today, you had mentioned Philly native DeAndre Hunter, currently playing for the Atlanta Hawks, could potentially be shopped this offseason. When you think about what Atlanta would look for in that situation, is the value players who are a better fit, because obviously they are in a bit of a volatile situation with their roster construction as well? Is it, kind of easing up their cap situation? What do you think Atlanta's desire is in that situation, and how do you think Philadelphia fits as a potential suitor in that case?
So it's a little bit of everything of what you mentioned. It's a little bit of bumping their roster cap. They're going to have the incoming number one pick if they hold on to it. And right there, that's a pretty big roster hit and cap hit. So when you're considering the number one pick coming in and potential moves that the Hawks could make, yeah, they could potentially move on from a guy like DeJounte Murray. But it's much more feasible to believe, and from people that I've talked to around the league, they believe that DeAndre Hunter and Clint Capella are going to be the two names that the Hawks look to move. Obviously, Capella being on the move, assuming that the Hawks draft either Alex Sarr or Donovan Clingan. And then DeAndre Hunter is a guy that hasn't necessarily panned out the best for them. He still has a few more years left on his contract in the $20 million range. A good two-way forward, but just a guy that they don't necessarily have a need for anymore. And taking the franchise in a different direction, you still have guys on your roster like Jalen Johnson, who's going to be getting more minutes moving forward. potentially re-signing Sadiq Bey. You just drafted AJ Griffin and you have him. So there's just, you got to move somebody. And with that kind of contract, you can bring back value, especially in terms of one or two role players and maybe a potential second late first round pick in a future draft. So I think that DeAndre Hunter definitely will have a market, especially considering that he is a good defensive option. He came from Virginia. They know how to defend there. We've seen it countless times where they're one of the best defensive teams in college basketball. And that held true when he was a part of that national championship team there. And in the NBA, I think that he's done a really good job of exhibiting his two-way potential out on the wing, a solid three-point shooter. I definitely think that he could present value to another team in this league. Obviously, when you look at the Philadelphia 76ers, well, the question now becomes, who are they going to give up? Because they don't have anybody under contract. So that would be a scenario where you would have to try to pull off a sign and trade. And the most likely name that you would involve is Tobias Harris right there. So would the Hawks want Tobias Harris? Probably not. So you'd now have to get a third team involved, maybe even a fourth team to facilitate it. And now things can get confusing with cap space and all that. So I wouldn't necessarily think that DeAndre Hunter would be a player that the 76ers would target right away. If he does remain on the Hawks roster heading towards the trade deadline, I certainly think that that's a different situation then.
Awesome. Fantastic. Brett, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you hopping on. And obviously, you've been doing a great job covering the league as a whole, but specifically Philadelphia at times as well. So just again, thank you so much. And again, Brett Siegel of Clutch Points. And where can everybody find your work? What would you like to mention for everyone listening and watching?
Well, on Twitter, you can follow me at Brett Siegel NBA. And as for where you can find my work, you can find it right next to Sam's on Clutch Points. He's got our 76ers vertical covered, and he does great work covering the team there. And heading towards draft season, there's going to be plenty of rumors, plenty of trade chatter, and then obviously free agencies right around the corner. You can follow all of our work, both of our work at Clutch Points. And it's just going to be a great off season. There's going to be plenty of movement, much more than we have seen in previous years.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, here's to a dramatic off season. Thanks, Brett. You have a great one.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Well, that I think was certainly fantastic. Shout out to Brett for hopping on the pod, of course, first and foremost. The Bronny conversation, again, still interesting. And I am slowly growing on him as a prospect. I think Jonathan Givony actually had a comp structurally to him and DeAnthony Melton. And I think that was the first moment where, my heart kind of started to budge on that topic. So Sam, just to kind of recap that conversation, that we just had with Brett, how do you feel about the potential of Bronny? Obviously you mentioned that there's a legitimate prospect in there, but when you think about whether it's pick 41 or, Philadelphia, the odds of them not making a trade on draft night seems almost impossible. So, however it ends up, let's assuming it's the second round. How do you feel personally about Bronny as a prospect in Philadelphia specifically?
So I think the Sixers have a pretty decent infrastructure. Obviously, when you think of a team like them, it's they're win now. They're all about trying to get experienced guys, but they do seem to put a good amount of investment into the development with the G League. Obviously, they were the champions a few years ago. They switched up their coaching staff, but their scouting department has been mostly good, I would say, at least relative to like what you would expect given where they've picked and whatnot, at finding guys who at least seem interesting, if not have become, ready-made contributors. So I think, having Bronny in that system, I think it would be pretty helpful for him. I can't speak too definitively about how other teams are with that, but I think with the Sixers, he would be pretty fine. One thing I would say, like, I guess this is more just like, is his style of play like at a median level, something that would fit in the Sixers, and that I kind of have questions about. Like he has so many questions on what he can do on offense as a ball handler, as an outside shooter. Now he did shoot a lot. Over half of his 3-point attempts came from deep at USC, and I think he shot pretty well in high school. Anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, but simply the fact that he shot so much, like got up that volume in college is good, and percentages aren't everything. I think with now that that health issue is hopefully fully behind him now, and he has more of a normal offseason, just get into training and keep it up. Like I think that should be helpful, and it wouldn't surprise me if he's like a decent shooter, but a player at his size, you probably would want more. And this is kind of dumbing it down into an experience that we've all kind of seen with the Sixers, but I wonder how much it's going to be like Jaden Springer, where, oh, this guy can defend. You know he can bring it on defense, but on offense, it's such a mixed bag. Can they find minutes for him? Now, I'm still on the side that I think they should have tried to find more minutes for Springer when he was here. Trading him wasn't like the worst thing. They at least now have a second round pick and some more cap space, to some more wiggle room there. So it's not like the worst trade, but I think that with his defense, he brought it every single night. And guys like that do have value, even if it's a very specific role, even if it's not that many minutes per game. Like those type of guys who can, I mean, Jaden Springer showed us in his last two games here, locking up Luka and Steph Curry, like just super impressive. And obviously, if Bronny becomes a defender of that level, that would be a fantastic outcome for him. Obviously, he's his own player, so I expect him to be, sort of different. But I do think like a defense first offense, highly questionable guard. Again, we just saw it not work out that well with Springer, so I do have my questions about Bronny, even though they are their own different prospects, their own different people. The Sixers are different now than they were when they drafted Springer. I don't think it would be a worse bet. I mean, in the second round, you're mostly just trying to find guys that can play at the NBA level. And if they do believe it's Bronny and they are not oblivious to the fact that having him might entice LeBron to get there if things go south with LA. I think at the 41st pick, that wouldn't be terrible, even if it'd be a little like it's hard to reach in the second round. So if they acquire a different pick, if they trade down to get another second and they roll the dice with Bronny, I don't think it would be a terrible thing.
Yeah, I think the second round is more so hit or miss than a matter of reaching or not reaching. Once you kind of hit that point, it's as simple as, do you believe in the guy or not? Do you think this is someone who can actually contribute? We've seen players. Paul Reed is a good example of a guy who was drafted at the tail end of the second round and still able to contribute. Guys at the front of it, like an Andrew Nemhard, it can come anywhere in the second round. I mean, that's true for the entire draft, but especially for the second round. I mean, even undrafted guys, Ricky Council Jr. is or Ricky Council the fourth, off by a couple Ricky Councils. Ricky Council the fourth is a guy who, obviously came in and as an undrafted rookie contributed in his first season. So the potential's there. I hear you on the size issues. And first of all, I also am a Jaden Springer truther. I just want to get that on the record. But moving off of that topic and getting kind of to the meat really there, Bronny at least can shoot better than Jaden Springer. I think that's the first bit of solace that you can kind of take in the idea of landing Bronny. His size is worse though. That's the obvious thing. He actually measured at the combine. I believe it was 6'1". That is the no shoes combine measurement. Like, clear difference between that and 6'4" Jaden Springer, who really was kind of built like a football player. That's part of the other difference there, though. I will say, Bronny at least gives the appearance of being strong as well, which should help him in his NBA career. I do kind of agree with what Brett said, though, just in terms of the potential players who could be around in that 41 spot. I just, looking at my own scouting, there's players who I think not only would Philadelphia prefer to target these guys, but they could potentially be grander contributors and potentially more impactful in a sooner fashion. So I actually just dropped my first mock draft for Metro Philadelphia today, Sixers mock draft. And, the kind of theme of the mock draft was experience. And that's something that Philadelphia clearly values. If they're going to go with a guy in the draft, they're either going to draft a guy with an immense amount of potential who they think that they can sell high on, or they're going to be looking for a guy who can potentially contribute as soon as possible, right? So Tristan DeSilva was the first pick there. I think that's a guy that we can all agree fits Philadelphia very well. But moving into the second round, and this is using ESPN's mock draft simulator, so I know there's probably going to be people who are saying he's not going to fall to 41. Keep this in mind. He was a fifth-year senior. He had a knee injury that kept him out of the tournament, kept him out of participation drills at the combine. But Kevin McCullough Jr. is a guy who theoretically could be around that range. And if you move up a little bit, or if you trade back from 16, these are all still possibilities. But that's the kind of guy who I think, and there's other guys who can contribute in similar ways, who more so you're going to be looking at. His size also not as great as initially thought. He measured a little smaller at the combine. He's still 6'5.5" without shoes. I mean, that's pretty solid on the wing there. So there's a long list of guys. There's going to be guys in the second round. Adem Bona is a guy who I'm extremely high on if they're looking for a backup center. You're talking about guys. KJ Simpson's kind of an interesting undersized guard, which kind of same territory as Bronny, but potentially a better fit for Philadelphia. And we could go on and on from there, and we will eventually, but just not today. So definitely a lot of different directions that they could take. I think the consensus is we're kind of out on Bronny in Philly. I know that's not necessarily a unique take, but I am growing on the concept of buying stock in Bronny in a general sense. So, we'll see what happens. Do want to give a quick shout out to, of course, co-host Justin Crosby, listening live from London. Took a little trip across the pond to watch some Phillies ball. Did a little work covering for PSN as well. Of course, hit up the boss man Liam Jenkins. So shout out Justin, listening live from London. Everybody in the chat, everybody watching, obviously, if you could like and share, we'd greatly appreciate it. But also, we'd like to get your take on not only Bronny and should the Sixers draft Bronny, should they sign LeBron James? And then from there, and this is where we're going to go now, is kind of talk about Brett's comments on DeAndre Hunter. Should they look into possibly trading for DeAndre? Or the biggest thing that I took away, and I want to also just talk about one additional way that Philadelphia could target him, right? So Brett mentioned that there's no path to matching salaries in the trade. And I think that that's a very real concern. I think there's a lot of validity to what he said in terms of providing Atlanta with capable players in the moment. And I think that's something that potentially, yes, they could be looking for. In terms of orchestrating the trade, it is possible if you're considering it not necessarily a salary dump, because I think that implies a negative contract, which we could talk about with DeAndre Hunter, but more so the potential of sending funds, sending, say, assets, draft pick compensation from Atlanta to Philly. There is the potential they'd have to relinquish the cap holds on several players, namely Tobias Harris, who carries a very lofty cap hold. But you're talking about cutting cap hold ties with Tobias, possibly Buddy Hield, or I should say likely Buddy Hield, likely Robert Covington, possibly Nico Batum, possibly DeAnthony Melton. And that really kind of cuts down on your optionality during the offseason. So that's kind of the big concern there. But, when we just look at the player and his potential fit, DeAndre Hunter in Philadelphia, Sam, what do you think of that potential concept when you're looking to possibly replace, whether you want to say he's replacing Tobias or potentially replacing Kelly Oubre?
Truthfully, it does not excite me all that much. He is a 3-and-D guy. I mean, obviously, the Philly connection is great to have. He is a 3-and-D guy by trade. That's kind of where he's, made his mark with the Hawks. But to me, it would just be like an okay move. Like, yeah, that's a guy that you can see fitting. But to me, not to be too mean, but he doesn't stand out like as a super spectacular addition. Looking at his contract, he's owed over $20 million per year in each of the next 3 seasons. And unless he makes a big jump with the Hawks, or some team thinks he is capable of making a bigger leap, I would be surprised to see him be in a trade that isn't either a salary dump where Atlanta's just trying to clear money and clear runway for young guns like AJ Griffin or Kobe Buffkin, or if they draft a wing to play, or if his money is aggregated with another player and Atlanta takes a swing on a star. Like, he's a fine 3-and-D guy, but he doesn't shoot particularly well at the rim. And obviously, he's going to do a lot of spot up shooting, so that kind of makes sense. But the fact that he's a big wing and doesn't shoot super well from up close is not great. His defense is solid. Obviously, the build is there, and as Brett mentioned, the fact that he played at Virginia gives him, that sort of pedigree. And maybe Nick Nurse could mold him into somebody who's better than he was in Atlanta. But I would not have a lot of optimism there. It's tough to judge players in not so great situations. So maybe if he was in a better spot than Atlanta, some of his strengths would pop more, some of his weaknesses wouldn't be as exposed. But as it stands right now, I think if the Sixers do trade for him, it would be like an okay move. One of the uses that maybe they could go for him is something that I believe Jake Fisher reported on, the possibility of doing a like an inflated contract on short-term money to make a trade down the line again. So what Jake mentioned was kind of like a 1+1. DeAndre Hunter has 3 guaranteed years left, so it wouldn't be quite that, but it would give the Sixers more chances to do it with a guy who is still relatively young. He's still just 26, so he's in his. At least he's not going to like fall off a cliff anytime soon. But I don't know. On the list of additions the Sixers could make, that would make me like much more hopeful for the chances of winning. DeAndre Hunter would not be quite high, truthfully.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's all about perspective. It's obviously not like an acquisition for Paul George. There's levels to it, right? So the cost is going to be the biggest sticking point. And I thought what Brett said was interesting, where he said, talking about a late first round pick, possible second round pick to acquire him. If Atlanta does value saving their space against the cap, right? So they're currently just a little bit under 11 million away from the first apron. That's before bringing back any of their free agents, potentially adding any more free agents. If they want to increase that space, then that's a situation where you can talk about potentially lowering what the assets you'd be giving up would be. And if we're talking about a second round pick, Philadelphia has the 41st pick in this draft. Atlanta has no second round picks in this draft. That's a potential fit right there. Now, again, it gets tricky when you're talking about how to structure this in a way that Philadelphia can receive that contract without giving anything up. However, if you're willing to do that for a player like DeAndre Hunter just for the cost of a second round pick, I think the worth is clearly there. But with that being said, you bring in up balloon contracts that Jake Fisher mentioned. If you are confident that you can get some of those guys on your list of who you believe are worth those balloon contracts, then I think that's a situation where you think, well, why would we, worry about DeAndre Hunter? Let's go for let's try and swing it big first for the stars, and then let's go for the balloon contracts from there, right? So, Contavious Caldwell-Pope was obviously a player that was mentioned. I would rather sign Contavious Caldwell-Pope for nothing to similar money to what DeAndre Hunter has than go out and make the trade for Hunter and possibly just throw off the groove, as it were, of the offseason. Because again, with the draft coming before free agency, that's another wrinkle that kind of keeps this entire narrative interesting. If you're talking about a guy like, and I don't necessarily consider it a balloon contract, you can throw an inflated deal at Malik Monk. Like, his range has been talked about around that 20 to 25 million. If you're going to throw, a guy like Contavious Caldwell-Pope, who is probably worth around what his option is for about $15 million. If you're going to throw him 20, 22 million, increase that by 5 to 7, throw an extra 5 to 7 at Malik Monk. And I'd be perfectly fine with that as well. Again, it's not my preferred option, but if you're talking about balloon contracts, I'm totally cool if you want to go, say, 2 years, 60 million for Malik Monk, or a 390, something such as that. A player who is going to age better, a player who clearly fits a need. Obviously, he's not a defensive star for you, but somebody who solves a plethora of other needs that you have to address if you're Philadelphia. And you got to compete with not only Sacramento, but Orlando, Detroit. And those two are other big spenders this offseason. So it's definitely going to be interesting there. But the balloon contract is definitely an interesting mention there. Just kind of while we're on the subject, and I'm kind of ambushing you with this conversation. So that Jake Fisher report's been out for a few weeks now. The concept of balloon targets has kind of been out there. Is there a name that you kind of associated with that, other than the ones that he mentioned, Caldwell Pope, and he also mentioned Klay Thompson? Is there a player in free agency that you just think, that's a guy that they could target on a balloon deal, maybe send, X amount over X years, and that's a guy that I'd be okay with on a balloon deal? Is there a guy that in your mind that you can think of?
There's not one that sticks out, but I think the important thing to keep in mind with balloon contracts is that, obviously you're going to be signing someone to a contract that's a little more than what they're actually worth. But the point of it is to sign a player that any team could bring in with no problem, or most teams at least, right? If the goal is obviously to sign that inflated contract and potentially use it in a trade later, you want to make sure it's a guy who would fit in any other team. And so 3-and-D wings like KCP and Klay Thompson, that's why they make so much sense. Bruce Brown, a little different of a player, but he's a solid player off the bench who can do a lot of different things. That's why it kind of worked out for him. And looking at just some of the top names by points per game who are free agents this summer, I think the most sensible thing to do is, obviously it depends on like what type of player the Sixers think they can get, and obviously just because you're signing a balloon contract doesn't mean you want to automatically give somebody a max. You still want it to be like a reasonable-ish contract. So I think it might make sense to target, a sharpshooter off the wing, like a guy like Gary Trent, or Malik Beasley, or Luke Kennard, or even Buddy Hield. Like these are guys who, obviously, as we saw with Buddy, their value in the playoffs is kind of questionable. They obviously have to prove, they can hang in other areas. But if you're just getting a guy who, hey, we're just going to throw a bunch of money at you, we might trade you. We just want you to shoot threes for the time being, help us get our floor spacing right until we potentially move you. I don't think that would be a bad decision. Again, I think for a 1+1, it's perfectly fine. There are plenty of guys who playing next to Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey, and hopefully another guy who can kind of do some playmaking. That's what I personally hope they are looking for alongside more of a permanent fit alongside Joel and Tyrese. But having a guy that can just get up those threes, I think would be super good to just have on the floor. But also as a guy who, if you're looking to flip later, another team could look at and be like, yeah, we can take on this guy. It's fine. So any of those guys, there's plenty of other guys who are bigger wings, like DeAndre Hunter's teammate, or maybe ex-teammate now, Sadiq Bey, Simone Fontecchio. There are plenty of other options out there. So I think the main thing is just find, some wing that fits kind of well that another team could talk themselves into either off the bench or in their starting lineup to use in exchange for their star, while they take that other player on the balloon deal and just ride it out for the time being.
Yeah. So obviously, wing ideal fit. Daryl Morey was very clear on that. Something else that he was very clear about, and we were both there for his end of season presser. The team is not going to. The way that he phrased it insinuates that they're not going to repeat past mistakes. Is how I'll phrase it without naming names. So they're not going to sign non-star players to star deals. That's what they've made clear. The concept of a balloon contract is different, to be clear, as you even stated into. I absolutely understand the idea of targeting a wing. I'm glad that you mentioned that. That kind of furthers my agenda for Caleb Martin joining the Philadelphia 76ers. That's a guy who I feel like even his balloon deal, we're talking like 230, 2 years, $30 million, something like that. Not even as expensive as some of these other balloon guys out there. You mentioned Buddy Hield, which I thought was another fantastic name and this is kind of where I've settled with Buddy all season. There's been reports of him possibly joining teams like, I think it was Denver, Minnesota. Basically, there was a report that listed several teams that are under the second apron and other teams that were under the first apron. The amount of money that he would have to sign with those teams, Philadelphia can easily beat without putting themselves under any general financial hardship, which leads me to my point that Buddy Hield, in my opinion, is, unless he has, a kind of bag offer from Orlando or Detroit or some other third team, his best position is possibly a 1+1 with Philadelphia. And, we can talk numbers. What does that look like? Is that 2 years 20, 2 years 30, 2 years 40? Like whatever that is, that's between Philadelphia and Buddy's representation. But I'm not ready for the Buddy Hield experiment to end. I'll be flat honest with you. I think that there is a way for this to fit. And now if it's a matter of, signing a guy like Paul George or not, obviously you're going to target the star in that situation. But, if you have the opportunity to better your team and also regain, like if you're talking about, let's say, for instance, break it down this way. If you're talking about Buddy Hield or Gary Trent Jr., and I understand the Gary Trent Jr., Nick Nurse stuff from the past, but just bear with me for a second.
I did not.
If we're talking,
I did not think of that. That is interesting. I didn't realize they were guys that had some beef in Toronto.
Well, so when you're talking about beef with, it's an interesting conversation, because when you talk about beef with Nick Nurse, like there's guys like Pascal Siakam seemed like to kind of clearly have beef with Nick Nurse. Then there's guys like, so Gary Trent Jr. had public comments on basically the fact that Nick Nurse or that criticism would be heard by their coach putting it into the public eye before it was given directly to the player. That was kind of the issue that was at hand.
Okay.
Whether that means that Gary Trent has a real problem with Nick Nurse, or it was, just something he was pissed off about in the moment. Like there's levels to it. I don't think that you can definitively look at that and say, oh, well, he'll never want to play for Nick Nurse again. And obviously money talks. So that's a factor as well. But, just taking kind of two similar players, both have ties to this Philadelphia 76ers team, whether it's just directly to the coach or literally playing for the team last year. I'm willing to bet more on Buddy Hield than I am on and the name has completely forgotten me. I was just
On
talking about
Trent?
him. Gary Trent Jr. Yes, I'm willing to bet more on Buddy Hield than Gary Trent Jr. Just the way that he's been historically, and to the point where Gary Trent Jr.'s name completely left my mind because I'm so in on Buddy Hield. Over exaggeration, but you get where I'm going with it. Like just what Buddy did show. Again, I get what happened in the playoffs. I'm not over investing just in that final game performance that Buddy had. I do think that his performance is likely somewhere in between. So we saw the bones to how he can fit with this roster. I am willing to admit that he probably wasn't consistently utilized in the way best suiting his talents. And I can certainly say that he could have played a lot better and been more aggressive at the same time. So there's not really blame just to put on one particular person as to why it didn't work. Daryl Morey was upfront that it didn't work, but he was also upfront that doesn't mean that it couldn't work if they were to re-sign him. So Buddy Hield is definitely a balloon contract guy in my mind, but those are just a few of the potential names if they do decide to kind of go in that direction. So of course, everyone, if you could like and share, repost, we do very much appreciate it. But also in the chat, do throw in people who you think that the Sixers should target on potential balloon contracts, or are you just sure that they should be going after stars? And it seems pretty clear that Daryl Morey's hell bent on that. Not that that's a bad thing, but whether or not you are of the role player faith, or if you're saying that they should go out and get stars, if it's even realistic, because obviously, as we talked about with Brett today, a lot of the cases with these stars, it's not necessarily in Philadelphia's hands. So either way, it's going to be interesting from here. But thank you so much for joining us today as we had Brett Siegel of Clutch Points on with us. Of course, Sam DiGiovanni, also of Clutch Points, as always with us today. Myself, I've been Zach Chavalella. Thank you again so much for watching, for listening, and stay tuned for another episode of Still Processing, a 76ers podcast.